Okay, so we are on chapter 23, The Badlands. Gramps said, "How's your snake leg gooseberry?" He was worried about Gram, but less about her leg than her raspy breathing. "We'll stop in the Badlands, okay?" Gram merely nodded. The closer we got to the Badlands, the more wicked were the whispers in the air. "Slow down, slow, slow, slow." "Maybe we shouldn't go to the Badlands," I suggested. "What? Not go? Of course we should go," Gramps said. "We're almost there. It's a national treasure." My mother must have traveled on this road. What was she thinking about when she saw that sign or that one? When she reached this spot in the road? My mother did not drive. She was terrified of cars. "I don't like all that speed," she said. "I like to be in control of where I'm going and how fast I'm going." When she said she was going all the way to Lewiston, Idaho on a bus, my father and I were astonished. I could not imagine why she had chosen Idaho. I thought perhaps she had opened an atlas and pointed a finger at any old spot, but later I learned that she had a cousin in Lewiston, Idaho. "I haven't seen her for 15 years," my mother said, "and that's good because she'll tell me what I'm really like." "I could tell you that, sugar," my father said. "No, I mean before I was a wife and a mother. I mean underneath, where I'm Chen Hassan." After driving for so long through the flat South Dakota prairie, it was a shock to come upon the Badlands. It was as if someone had ironed out all the rest of South Dakota and smushed all the hills and valleys and rocks into this spot. Right smack in the middle of flat plains were jagged peaks and steep gorges. Above was the high blue sky, and below were the pink and purple and black rocks. You can stand right on the edge of the gorges and see down, down into the most treacherous ravines, lined with sharp, rough outcroppings. You expect to see human skeletons dangling here and there. Graham tried to say huzza huzza, but could not breathe well. "Huzz, huzz," she rasped. Gramps placed a blanket on the ground so that he could sit. Sorry, Gramps placed a blanket on the ground so that she could sit and look. My mother sent two postcards from the Badlands. One of them said, "Salamanca is my left arm. I miss my left arm." I told Gram and Gramps a story that my mother had told me about the high sky, which looked higher here than anywhere else I had been. Long ago, the sky was so low that you might bump your head on it if you were not careful, and so low that people sometimes disappeared right up into it. People got a little fed up with this, so they made long poles, and one day they all raised their poles and pushed. They pushed the sky as high as they could. "And looky there," Gramps said. "They pushed so good the sky stayed put." While I was telling the story, a pregnant woman stood nearby, dabbing at her face with a tissue. "That woman looks world weary," Gramps said. He asked her if she would like to rest on our blanket. "I'll go look around," I said. Pregnant woman frightened me. When my mother first told me she was pregnant, she added, "At last! You really are going to fill this house up with children." At first, I didn't like the idea. What was wrong with having just me? My mother, father, and I were our own little unit. As the baby grew inside her, my mother let me listen to its heartbeat and feel it kicking against her, and I started looking forward to seeing this baby. I hoped it would be a girl, and I would have a sister. Together, my father, my mother, and I decorated the nursery. We painted it sparkling white and hung yellow curtains. My father stripped an old dresser and repainted it. People gave us the tiniest baby clothes. We washed and folded each shirt, each jumpsuit, each sleeper. We bought fresh new cloth diapers because my mother liked to see diapers hanging out on the line outside. The one thing we could not do was settle on a name. Nothing seemed quite right. Nothing was perfect enough for this baby. My father seemed more worried about this than my mother. "Something will come to us," my mother said. "The perfect name will arrive in the air one day." 3 weeks before the baby was due, I was out in the woods beyond the farthest field. My father was in town on errands. My mother was scrubbing the floors. She said, that scrubbing the floors made her back feel better. My father didn't like her to do this, but she insisted. My mother was not a fragile, sickly woman. It was normal for her to do this sort of thing. In the woods, I climbed an oak, singing my mother's song. Oh, don't fall in love with a sailor boy, a sailor boy, a sailor boy. I climbed higher and higher. Don't fall in love with a sailor boy. Then the branch I stepped on snapped, and I grabbed out at another, but it was dead and came away in my hands. I fell down, down, as if I were in slow motion. I saw leaves. I knew I was falling. When I came to, I was on the ground with my face pressed into the dirt. My right leg was twisted beneath me, and when I tried to move, it felt as if sharp needles were shooting all up and down my leg. I tried to drag myself across the ground, but the needles shot up into my brain and made everything black. There was a walloping buzzing in my head. I must have passed out again, because the next time I opened my eyes, the woods were darker and the air was cooler. I heard my mother calling. Her voice was distant and faint. Coming, I thought, from near the barn. I answered, but my voice was caught in my chest. My mother found me and carried me back through the woods, across the field, and down the long hill to the house. She called my grandparents to come take us to the hospital. It took forever just to get a cast, and by the time we got home, we were all exhausted. My father felt awful that he had been away and fussed over both of us constantly. The baby came that night. I heard my father telephoning the doctor. She won't make it, he said. It's happening now, right now. On my new crutches, I tottered down the hall. My mother was sunk into the pillow, sweating and groaning. Something's wrong, she said to my father. She saw me standing there and said, You shouldn't watch. I don't think I'm very good at this. So I'm going to have you guys read the rest of the rest of the section on your own. So at 151, go ahead and stop, and then we will discuss. So I'm going to pause.
What do you mean rest of the section?
Just one second. Let me pause this video. Where did I put it? Sadness. Okay, chapter 24, Birds of Sadness. As we were leaving the Badlands, Gramps swore at a driver who cut us off. Usually when Gramps cussed like this, Gram threatened to go back to the Eggman. I don't know the whole story, just that one time when Gramps was cussing up a storm, Gram ran off with the man who regularly bought eggs from Gramps. Gram stayed with the Eggman for 3 days and 3 nights until Gramps came to get her and promised he wouldn't swear anymore. I once asked Gram if she would really go back to the Eggman if Gramps cussed too much. She said, Don't tell your grandfather, but I don't mind a few hells and damns. Besides, that Eggman snored to beat the band. So you didn't leave Gramps just because of the cussing? Salamanca, I don't even remember why I did that. Sometimes you know in your heart you love someone, but you have to go away before your head can figure it out. That night, we stayed at a motel outside of Wall, South Dakota. They had one room left with only one bed in it, but Gramps was tired, so he said it would do. The bed was a king-size water bed. Gall dang, Gramps said. Looky there. When he pressed his hand on it, it gurgled. Looks like we'll all have to float on this raft together tonight. Gram flopped down on the bed and giggled. Huzz, huzz, she said in her raspy voice. She rolled into the middle. Huzz, huzz. I lay down next to her, and Gramps tentatively sat down on the other side. Whoa, he said. I do believe this thing's alive. The 3 of us lay there sloshing around as Gramps turned this way and that. Gall darn, he said. Tears were streaming down Gramps' face. She was giggling so hard. Gramps said, Well, this ain't our marriage bed. That night, I dreamed that I was floating down a river on a raft with my mother. We were lying on our backs looking up at the high sky. The sky moved closer and closer to us. There was a sudden popping sound, and then we were up in the sky. Mama looked all around and said, We can't be dead. We were alive just a minute ago. In the morning, we set out for the Black Hills and Mount Rushmore, hoping to be there by lunchtime. No sooner were we in the car than Gramps said, "So, what happened to Peebee's mother? And did Peebee get any more of those messages?" "I hope everything turns out all right," Gramps said. "I'm a little worried about Peebee." On the day after Phoebe showed her father the suspicious spots and the unidentifiable hair strands, another message appeared. "You can't keep the birds of sadness from flying over your head, but you can keep them from nesting in your hair." Phoebe brought the message to school to show me. "The lunatic again," she said. "If he has already kidnapped your mother, why would he still be leaving messages?" "They're clues," she said. At school, people kept asking Phoebe about her mother's business trip to London. She tried to ignore them, but it wasn't always possible. She had to answer some of the time. When Megan asked Phoebe what sights her mother had seen, Phoebe said, "Buckingham Palace." "Of course," Megan nodded knowingly. "And Big Ben." And Phoebe was struggling. "Shakespeare's birthplace." "But that's in Stratford-on-Avon," Megan said. "I thought your mother was in London. Stratford's miles away. Did she go on a day trip or something?" "Yes, that's what she did. She went on a day trip." Phoebe couldn't help it. She looked as if a whole family of birds of sadness were nesting in her hair. In English class, Ben had to give his mythology report. He was nervous. He explained that Prometheus stole fire from the sun and gave it to man. Zeus, the chief god, was angry at man and at Prometheus for taking some of his precious sun. As punishment, Zeus sent Pandora, a woman, to man. Then Zeus chained Prometheus to a rock and sent vultures down to eat Prometheus's liver. In Ben's nervousness, he mispronounced Prometheus. So what he actually said was that Zeus sent vultures down to eat Porpoise's liver. Mary Lou invited both me and Phoebe to dinner that night. When I phoned my father, he did not seem to mind. I knew he wouldn't. All he said was, "That will be nice for you, Sal. Maybe I'll go eat over at Margaret's." Chapter 25, Cholesterol. Dinner at the Finneys was an experience. When we arrived, Mary Lou's brothers were running around like crazed animals, jumping over furniture and tossing footballs. Mary Lou's older sister, Maggie, was talking on the telephone and plucking her eyebrows at the same time. Mr. Finney was cooking something in the kitchen with the help of 4-year-old Tommy. Phoebe whispered, "I'm not too optimistic about the possibilities of this meal." When Mrs. Finney staggered in the door at 6 o'clock, Tommy and Dougie and Dennis tugged at various parts of her, all of them talking at once. "Look at this!" and "Mom, Mom, Mom!" and "Me first!" She made her way into the kitchen, trailing all three of them like a fish hook that had snagged a tangle of old tires and boots and other miscellaneous rubbish. She gave Mr. Finney a sloppy kiss on the lips, and he slipped a piece of cucumber into her mouth. Mary Lou and I set the table, although I think it was largely a wasted effort. Everyone descended on the table in a chaotic flurry, knocking over glasses and sending forks onto the floor, and picking up plates which did not match, Phoebe pointed out to me, and saying, "That's my plate, and I want the daisy plate, and give me the blue one. It's my turn for the blue plate." Phoebe and I sat between Mary Lou and Ben. In the center of the table was a whomping platter of fried chicken. Phoebe said, "Chicken? Fried? I can't eat fried foods. I have a sensitive stomach." She glanced at the 3 pieces of chicken on Ben's plate. "You really shouldn't eat that, Ben. Fried foods aren't good for you. First of all, there's the cholesterol." Phoebe removed 2 pieces of chicken from Ben's plate and put them back on the serving platter. Mr. Finney coughed. Mrs. Finney said, "You're not going to eat the chicken then, Phoebe?" Phoebe smiled. "Oh no, Mrs. Finney, I couldn't possibly. Actually, Mr. Finney shouldn't be eating it either. I don't know if you're aware of this, but men should really be careful about their cholesterol." Mr. Finney stared down at his chicken. Mrs. Finney was rolling her lips around peculiarly. By this time, the beans had been passed to Phoebe. "Did you put butter on these beans, Mrs. Finney?" "Yes, I did. Is there something wrong with butter?" "Cholesterol," Phoebe said. "Cholesterol is in the butter." "Ah," Mrs. Finney said. "Cholesterol." She looked at her husband. "Be careful, dear. There's cholesterol on the beans." I stared at Phoebe. I am sure I was not the only one in the room who wanted to strangle her. Ben pushed his beans to one side of his plate. Maggie picked up a bean and examined it. When the potatoes came around, Phoebe explained that she was on a diet and could not eat starch. The rest of us looked glumly down at our plates. There was nothing at all on Phoebe's plate. Mrs. Finney said, "So what do you eat, Phoebe?" "My mother makes special vegetarian meals, low calorie and no cholesterol. We eat a lot of salads and vegetables. My mother is an excellent cook." She never mentioned the cholesterol in all those pies and brownies her mother made. I wanted to jump up and say, "Phoebe's mother's disappeared, and that's why Phoebe's acting like a complete donkey." But I didn't. Phoebe repeated, "A truly excellent cook." "Marvelous," Mrs. Finney said. "And what do you propose to eat tonight?" I don't suppose you have any unadulterated vegetables." "Unadulterated?" Mrs. Finney said. "It means unspoiled, without any butter or stuff added." "I know what it means, Phoebe," Mrs. Finney said. "I can eat unadulterated vegetables, or if you have any red bean salad handy, or stuffed cabbage leaves, broccoli and lentil casserole, macaroni and cheese, vegetarian spaghetti." One by one, everyone at the table turned to stare at Phoebe. Mrs. Finney got up from the table and went into the kitchen. We heard her opening and closing cupboards. She returned to the doorway. "Muesli?" She asked Phoebe. "Can you eat muesli?" Phoebe said, "Oh, yes, I eat muesli for breakfast." Mrs. Finney disappeared again and returned with a bowl of dried up muesli and a bottle of milk. "For dinner?" Phoebe asked. She gazed down at the bowl. "I usually eat it with yogurt on it, not milk," she said. Mrs. Finney turned to Mr. Finney. "Dear, did you buy any yogurt this week?" "Blast it, how could I forget the yogurt?" Phoebe ate her dried up muesli without milk. All through dinner, I kept thinking of Bybanks and what it was like when we went to my grandparents' house for dinner. There were always tons of people, relatives and neighbors, and lots of confusion. It was a friendly sort of confusion, and it was like that at the Finneys. Tommy spilled 2 glasses of milk. Dennis punched Dougie, and Dougie punched him back. Maggie socked Mary Lou, and Mary Lou flipped a bean at her. Maybe this is what my mother had wanted, I thought, a house full of children and confusion. On the way home, I said, "Didn't everyone seem unusually quiet after dinner?" Phoebe said it was probably because of all that cholesterol sitting heavily on their stomachs. I asked Phoebe if she wanted to spend the weekend at my house. I'm not sure why I did this. It was an impulse. I had not yet invited anyone to my house. She said, "I guess. That is, if my mother is still." She coughed. "Let's go ask my dad." In the kitchen, her father was washing the dishes. He was wearing a frilly apron over his white shirt and tie. "You're supposed to rinse the soap off," Phoebe said. "And is that cold water you're using? You're supposed to use really, really hot water to kill the germs." He didn't look at Phoebe. I thought maybe he was embarrassed to be caught doing the dishes. "You've probably washed that plate enough," Phoebe said. He had been rubbing it around and around with a dishcloth. He stopped and stared down at the plate. I could practically see the birds of sadness pecking at his head, but Phoebe was busy swatting her own birds. "Did you call all of Mom's friends?" Phoebe asked. "Phoebe," he said, "I'm looking into it. I'm a little tired. Do you mind if we don't discuss this now?" "But you don't think we should call the police, Phoebe?" "Sal wants to know if I can spend the weekend at her house." "Of course," he said. "But what if Mom comes back while I'm at Sal's? Will you call me? Will you let me know?" "Of course." "Or what if she telephones? Maybe I should stay home. I think I should be here when she calls." If she calls. If she telephones, I will have her call you at Sal's," he said. "But if we don't have any news by tomorrow," Phoebe said, "we should definitely call the police. We've waited too long already. What if she's tied up somewhere and waiting for us to rescue her? At home that night, I was working on my mythology report when Phoebe called. She was whispering. When she went downstairs to say goodnight to her father, he was sitting in his favorite chair staring at the television, but the television wasn't on. If she didn't know her father better, she would have thought he had been crying. But my father never cries, she said.